My daughter used to see me reading no sleep stories and asked me to read them to her. That's when her obsession with horror began. I found a story that was tame and dumbed it down so she could understand it. I thought it would still scare her, but the whole time she had a huge smile on her face. So, I kept reading to her, usually one story a day, but sometimes I'd dangle a second story as incentive for her to behave. A lot of your posts get a little gruesome, so most of the time I add in a Scooby Doo and a few more hijinks and a less bloody murder to make it more child friendly. So she was only slightly spooked, but still enthralled. When I got a new laptop for work, I wiped the memory, made sure to uninstall all of the browser so she couldn't use the internet just in case she figured out how to connect the Wi Fi. That way, she could play games like Freddy Fish or Pajama Sam. I don't have to worry about her going onto the internet and stumbling upon something she shouldn't. She started using the laptop to write her own short horror stories. Every time she finished a story, she would email it to me by printing them out and putting them in an envelope. She would write a big E on it and hand them to me. She would always beg me to stop whatever I was doing and read it. However, when I finished, she would always ask if her story had scared me. But I never had that heart to tell her that her stories were more adorable than scary. They were just mostly about princesses getting kidnapped by bad guys or kittens fighting off monsters, and almost all of her stories had Scooby Doo in them. Father like daughter, I suppose. Even though I obviously wasn't spooked, I would always tell her that she scared me, and she would always respond the same way. No way! Daddies aren't scared of anything. Now I'm certain that any parent out there can tell you that is a load of shit. We are afraid of many things. I'm afraid of losing my job so I can't provide for my family, or something bad happening to my wife or daughter. I remember back to when she was first born. It drove me crazy whenever my wife would turn her back on the cart when she was in it. I was paranoid about someone would snatch my little girl right out of the cart. After all, whenever a child gets kidnapped, they would say, "I only looked away for a minute." The day came when one of my daughter's stories actually did scare me. It's kind of hard to explain, so I'll post a story. It went like this. Sherry's boyfriend went out and bought some magical pixie dust. He gave the pixie dust to Sherry and told her it was sugar. He was lying to her. Sugar was so excited that she ate a whole bunch with her nose. Then she started dancing. Then she started twitching. Then she died. No one ever found out. No one ever found out that Sherry's boyfriend did what Sherry's boyfriend did. The fact that someone died in one of her stories was off-putting enough, but an obvious reference to drug overdose was not a normal thing for a 7-year-old to write about. Even when I finished reading the story, my daughter was looking up at me with her big grin asking, "Did I scare you?" I tried asking where she heard the story, but she insisted she made it up. She grabbed my arm and kept asking if she scared me. For the first time since she started writing, I honestly told her yes. "No way! Daddies aren't scared of anything," she said, and skipped off to go play. I showed the story to my wife, and she looked at me with a scowl, scolding me for reading to our daughter so many scary stories off the internet. I told her that I'd never read a story like this, and that I have never read a story where someone died. I asked my wife if it was possible that our daughter had seen it on a show that she had left on. My wife said that she hadn't watched any adult shows without me in weeks. I was convinced my daughter must have seen the story on TV, and that my wife was just out of the room, or maybe someone at our school gave her the idea. I kept racking my brain trying to come up with an answer. But then she wrote another story a couple of days later, and it was back to her usual subject matter. I decided to let it go. About a week later, my wife texted me a link to a news site. A young girl named Cheryl died of a heroin overdose. Apparently, she got the heroin from her boyfriend, who told her it was coke. The article said her death was being labeled an accident and that her boyfriend wouldn't be charged at this time. It didn't take me long to make the connection. Someone must have left the news on and my daughter heard this story. It's possible she didn't even know that's what where this story inspiration came from. She just remembers an event. I thought about trying to talk to her about drugs and the story again, but she was her usual self, so the story just was a story to her, and I didn't want her to make a connection to some horrible real event. More stories came, all standard fare. I could tell her that these stories were much better and much scarier than the Sherry story. It seemed like we were moving past everything until she wrote another really scary story. Danny was bored, so he stole a car. Danny was a bad boy. He didn't realize that the car belonged to a bad man. When the bad man found Danny, he shot Danny in the head, and then the bad man drove away. This story was worse than the first one. Somewhat childlike wording of the first one softened the blow and made it a bit easier to process. This story had no padding. It was there in your face, shot Danny in the head. I never thought I would hear those words from my little girl. My daughter was still looking up at me with her big green eyes, waiting for me to say what I always said. I asked her where she heard the story, but just like she did with the Sherry story, she insisted that she made it up. I told her that the story was mean and that she shouldn't write stories like this anymore. She argued with me, and I ended up grounding her from writing. The next day I had to work late. I was waiting for my partner to finish a bit that I needed, so I thought I would take a second to see if I could find anything about my daughter's story. If she had heard the first one on the news, then she probably heard this one too. A little bit of Googling turned up a story about a boy named Daniel who was found dead near the interstate. The police thought it was a mugging gone wrong. Two things stuck out to me. One, Daniel had previously served time in juvie for Grand Theft Auto. Two, he was shot in the head. I couldn't turn any more stories with a victim named Danny, Dan, or Daniel, or anything else that was similar. This had to have been the story that you heard. The only problem being was that the story was posted almost 24 hours after I read my daughter's story. That didn't make sense to me. I checked every news site I could find. They all said Danny was killed in the night after my daughter wrote the story about him. I went back and looked at the story about Sherry, and it was the same. Had they found Sherry dead 2 days earlier after my daughter had wrote the story? How did my daughter write a story so eerily similar to the real-world event before the event happened? And it had to have been a coincidence, right? I was quiet when I got home that night, and so was my daughter. My wife told me that my daughter was sick and asked me if I was feeling under the weather as well. I told her that I was, and it wasn't technically a lie since I was feeling sick. I just didn't think the pain in my stomach and the tightness in my chest had anything to do with a virus my daughter had. The next day was a fog for me, but I ended up getting out of work on time for once. When I got home, I noticed that my daughter's laptop was on the kitchen counter, and my wife seemed to be in a very bad mood. When I asked about the laptop, my wife told me that since our daughter was sick in bed, she gave her the laptop so she could pass the time. But my wife had to take the laptop away from her, and she wasn't allowed to write any more stories. I asked her why she was so on edge, even though the answer was obvious. My wife pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of the trash and handed it to me. She wrote another story, and I completely understand why my wife wouldn't want her writing anymore. Everything typed there makes my chest tighten like crazy. Daddy got mad. Daddy tied me and Mommy downstairs in the basement. I'm fine. I'm hungry and thirsty. Daddy brought me a t-ball bat and hit my Mommy with it until she stopped moving. After Daddy left, Mom made scary noises for a while. Mommy hasn't made any noise in a while, though. Daddy hasn't stopped crying since Mommy stopped moving. I hope Mommy and Daddy feel better. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope that you guys come watch the next one. Alright everybody, stay savvy.